I'm Joe McCann, CEO and founder of NodeSource, and today I'll be talking with you about the hidden costs of free software and how to manage the risks around open source. But first, quick plug on our company. We are NodeSource, the Node.js company. We've been around for a little less than 4 years. We are explicitly focused on Node.js in the enterprise. If you're not familiar with Node, it is the fastest growing open source project on earth in terms of users. By the end of this year, according to the Linux Foundation, nearly half of all software developers on earth will be using Node, which means it's very likely that folks here or in your organizations are also using Node.js. I've been involved with Node since the very beginning in late 2009 and in open source for many years before that. So I'm in a unique position to talk a little bit about the sort of benefits and also the risks around open source. And for years, I've been trying to figure out a way of describing what open source is and frankly, why somebody would pay for something when it's free. And I keep trying to think through different analogies and what are the ways that make sense to people that aren't necessarily in technology. And it dawned on me. You have to start off with an adorable picture of a puppy. So why am I showing you an adorable picture of a puppy? Well, this is what open source is like. Someone hands you a free puppy for a second, maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute. You're like, oh my God, this puppy, it's so adorable. It's got that puppy smell, it's super soft, it's little whimpers, right? For just a few seconds, that's that feeling, right? And then you're like, wait a second, I gotta take care of this thing, right? That's what open source is like. It's amazing at the beginning, and then you've gotta take care of it, right? So, for a puppy, there's a handful of things that you have to do. You've got to feed it, and groom it, and train it, take it on walks, these types of things, right? That's the same sort of thing that you've got to do with open source. Once you've sort of got past that initial honeymoon phase, if you will, you've got to secure it. You've got to have folks that can support it, whether it's internal or external. You have to educate your folks internally on the technology or the infrastructure itself. And then also, you have to make sure that you can trust that open source technology and also verify that it is in fact doing what it says it's going to do. And so getting through this task list might seem a little daunting, but given the spirit of being inside of a large bank right now, let's talk about the rewards as opposed to the risks first. So I'm sure you've probably heard a number of times today the various benefits of open source. I want to click into a few of these so that it makes sense on how to manage the risk around them. First, it's around security. So we've heard this myth a lot that open source software must be more insecure than proprietary closed source software. I would argue that all software is actually insecure, but the way that you manage the risk around the security of that, I think, is what's most important. And one of the benefits to open source technology is that there's this continuous peer review that happens with the source code of open source tech. And in addition to that, I'd argue that the Linux and Node.js and Cassandra database, et cetera, have hundreds, if not thousands, of sets of eyes on the source code itself. So there's arguably infinitely more eyes looking at the source code, identifying vulnerabilities, performance issues, et cetera, versus one team. A lot of folks have an internal service provider inside their organization to provide tech and infrastructure to other teams. Well, the open source community is much broader than that one team that you probably have at your organization. And then finally, there is a risk around just using a closed source vendor for closed source proprietary software when it comes to actual vulnerabilities. You're now reliant on them to give you a patch. Whereas in the open source world, these patches tend to come a lot faster, Next up, the talent quotient around open source technologies. You know, I was speaking with a very large animation studio out of Hollywood a couple years ago, and they said to me, Joe, we feel like we're kind of boxed in. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, we've built our entire business on this proprietary stack, this proprietary programming language, and folks are retiring and moving on, and, well, we can't hire anybody. What are we going to do? And I suggested they start thinking about adopting and integrating open source technologies into their organization. And the reason is these skills are transferable. Every company today is now a technology company, which means the war for talent around software development, architects, et cetera, is at the highest it's ever been. Is someone going to want to go to a place where they could only know the technology at that particular location? No. Secondarily, there's a large pool of talent around open source that you can verify their skills by their activity in open source. You know, one of the biggest benefits to the sort of GitHub native set of developers today is that it's very transparent and collaborative on the types of projects that they're interested in and how they actually do their work. And then finally, I think another benefit that you get from open source is this access to really creative thinkers, non-traditional computer science majors, so to speak, that are arguably influential in open source tech and the support and sort of progression of open source technologies. This is the piece I think everybody can really get behind, saving money. With open source, you know, the traditional per-seat license for open source technology drops to zero. There is no cost associated with using it on a per-seat license. Moreover, you don't see any vendor lock-in with an open source technology. Now, there's nuance to all of these, I understand that, but as opposed to an unnamed massive software company that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, there are ways of locking you in that can be very detrimental, whether it's through legal, SLAs, et cetera. And then I think one of the most interesting things around cost savings when it comes to open source is that reduced total cost of ownership. The fact that the open source technology is spread across so many people and so many collaborators means you get access to talent for next to nothing, if not actually free. And in fact, I think it was earlier this year, the Linux Foundation estimated that if you were today going to support building the Fedora 9 Linux distribution to use inside your organization, it would cost almost $11 billion. Let me repeat that, $11 billion. This shared total cost of ownership is across many people today because of the benefits of things like open source. Next up, accelerating time to market. If you haven't heard the buzzword today yet, digital transformation, here we go. Every company that we seem to talk to has a digital transformation strategy of sorts. And the challenge is how do we move fast, but we can't move fast and break things like Facebook does. We have to move fast and keep the lights on and stay compliant and maintain our security. Well, open source is a path to accelerating your digital transformation efforts. For one, there's no license restrictions on who can use it. So you can have multiple people using open source technology. Number two, there's no restrictions on the source code, with a big asterisk here, depending on the license of the open source technology itself. But there's many use cases that this technology can be applied to as opposed to very specific and limited use cases in closed source and proprietary. And then finally, open source technology is really well suited for experimentation and rapid prototyping to get things to market faster or to ditch them altogether, as opposed to using some sort of heavy proprietary stack that you really have to invest in financially and from an education standpoint only to turn out that it's the wrong tool for the job. Open source is pretty fluid in that way. And I think this brings it to another point that I want to hammer home around open source itself. Over the past decade or so, certainly past couple of decades with folks like Salesforce, the way that we've delivered applications has changed to software as a service. Well, with open source, it's just a new way of delivering infrastructure, right? Today, we deliver software via SaaS, And today we deliver infrastructure or even application infrastructure through open source. It's simply a distribution mechanism for new forms of infrastructure and technology. But it's not all rosy. There are risks associated with using open source technology. Like these: brand risk, compliance risk, PII exposure, just operational risk. And last but not least, revenue risk. And I'm going to go over a handful of examples that hopefully some of you are familiar with, and if not, it should really open your eyes to the type of risks that come with using open source, not in usage sake, but using it without the proper set of tools and best practices around how to manage that risk. So first and foremost, there was a bug that came out a couple years ago in OpenSSL called Heartbleed. This was a dead simple way for people to steal data directly from your users. Moreover, more than 2/3 of all web servers on the planet were impacted. This is how big an issue it is around the support or the commercial support of open source technologies like OpenSSL. They in fact had very few developers working it out on the time, and had to have some sort of emergency resources applied to the project to get a patch in place to be distributed out. Something that's near and dear to our heart at NodeSource is NPM. NPM stands for Node Package Manager. If you're familiar with Java, that's Maven or NuGet in .NET. NPM is this massive ecosystem of node modules or packages that developers can use to build their applications. However, in March of last year, a disgruntled author of a package decided, you know what, I'm just going to take my package off the registry. I'm going to unpublish it. Unfortunately, this tiny little package was a dependency on thousands of other packages inside NPM, and it caused widespread disruption and outages and breaking builds left and right because so many other projects were dependent upon this one 27-line code package. This operational risk is difficult to identify when you're relying on the wild, wild west of the open source ecosystem that is NPM today. Now, this is a unique way of sort of labeling this risk, this hidden or embedded risk. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean embedded in terms of embedded software. What I mean is that you have an open source technology or an open source framework that relies on other open source technologies or frameworks that sort of injects some hidden risk into using it. So for example, there's this project called Electron that is an open source framework for building native desktop applications with web technologies. Under the hood, it's powered by Node.js, and it's also powered by Chromium. Now, Chromium is the open source project that Google funds and is what more or less creates Google Chrome, the web browser. Now, what's the problem here? Google Chrome has an auto-update feature. There are security vulnerabilities discovered and patched seemingly every day with Google Chrome, but you as a user, it's opaque to you. Why? Because the app is auto-updating. However, Electron has a dependency on Chromium. And so when you package together an Electron app and you send it out and people download it and run it, there's no auto-update feature. Well, now, if there was a security vulnerability exposed in Chromium that was patched in Google Chrome, because it was the auto-update feature, that still exists in your Electron apps. These are the type of risks that are hidden from folks using these new open source technologies that have these hardcore dependencies on other projects that are massive in scale and nature and, frankly, in footprint. Google actually spends about $1 billion a year just on the Chromium project with over 500 engineers. However, Electron doesn't necessarily imply that you get all of that security relief. And how could I not talk at a bank without mentioning cryptocurrencies? Back in May, Coinbase, which is now I think a unicorn status startup out of the Bay Area, they are more or less a wallet / exchange for buying and selling Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Litecoin at this point. But back in May, they saw a massive spike in traffic, and it caused a significant amount of downtime. What's the risk here? Well, 10 years ago, I remember back in my ad agency days, we used to think, oh, if the website crashes, it's a huge success, right? There's so much traffic. That's not the case anymore. Now there's a huge brand and reputational risk, not only to mention potential revenue risk associated with this downtime. With Coinbase, for example, they had this huge spike in traffic because of the price fluctuations that were happening with Bitcoin and Ethereum at the time. And this highlighted area here showcases how much traffic was coming in on their primary load balancer. That wasn't the problem. The problem was their MongoDB instances. Now, Coinbase, theoretically, are experts in cryptocurrencies, which is also debatable. Is anybody an expert in that? But they're not experts in MongoDB. They might be really good at scaling databases, but they're not the best at it. And so what they ended up having to do was call in the experts, right? But the problem with that is that you're reacting to the situation as opposed to being proactive in how you can actually support your open source infrastructure needs. Last but not least, yes, we have to go there. We have to talk about Equifax. I'm sure everyone in this room, or at least half of this room, is impacted by the breach that came out back in September. And the saddest part about this is that it was completely avoidable. You see, Equifax used an open source Java web framework called Apache Struts that had a vulnerability in it. But that wasn't the problem. The patch was actually released back in March of earlier this year. The problem was it wasn't patched at Equifax. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons, and I'm sure we could throw some people under the bus, but I'm not going to do that. I think the point is that Equifax isn't in the business of managing and maintaining application infrastructure like Apache Struts. That's the job of an open source vendor. Now, this was the result. Equifax had a $16 billion market cap, and within 6 trading days after the breach, $5 billion of market cap had evaporated. Now, granted, I think it's trading up near 107, 108 as it stands today. They made back some of that ground. But the brand and reputational risk for someone that's evaluating your credibility is extremely tarnished at this point. How could they have solved for something like this? How could they have potentially prevented something like this and been more proactive? A $250,000 vendor support contract. This is part and parcel to the majority of open source vendors today, is that they provide insurance, they provide expertise, they provide the support for something that inherently does not have support. Open source is great because it's collaborative and there's a community behind it. That also means that no one is accountable. Well, how do you have a throat to choke or someone to rely on when you're using open source technology? That's where something like a support contract can come into place and is a perfect segue into our best practices. So, I'm not trying to scare everyone here into not using open source. I'm trying to get people to understand that there are risks around using any technology, but specifically around open source. And a handful of best practices to help mitigate some of this start with an enterprise-grade vendor support contract. We are the Node.js company at NodeSource. We would love to be, the vendor for any and all people here, but your other open source technologies will also need some sort of support associated with it. And folks like Red Hat and IBM and others can provide these types of things at a larger scale as opposed to something as specific as what we do. And if you don't still believe that it's good enough for you, it's good enough for the United States Department of Defense. They have explicitly outlined that no matter what the software project is, or the software that's being used for specific projects or missions, as they call it, there is an absolute requirement for either commercial or government program office support. This is a no-brainer to folks like the Department of Defense. It should be a no-brainer for the Fortune 500. Next up is best-in-class tooling. And you say, well, wait, what do you mean? I thought open source was really good. It's really fast, it's safe, there's a lot of people looking at it, a lot of contributors. That's right. But this is the question you should ask yourself. You can run the open source version of something in production, but should you? And I think that's the question that gets left out in a lot of cases when people start to think about, well, maybe I should pay for a commercial version of MongoDB, for example, or Node.js, for example. And this is, the thing that is near and dear to my heart at NodeSource, because this is what we specialize in. We actually do provide those types of tools around mission-critical applications, right? Our customers span from folks like PayPal to MasterCard to Condé Nast, and the reason is that they're relying on Node for mission-critical applications, and the open source technology itself is good, but it's not great for production use cases. So we've launched this product called NSolid, which is effectively Node.js on steroids, is how you can think about it. It's the operational and secure way of running Node in production. And you say, well, how different are you, and why should I pay for something like that? Here's why. The left-hand side is a set of features that only a few show up in the open source project. NSolid, our product, has all of these features and capabilities baked into it because this is what it's designed for. It's not designed necessarily for internal applications or small proofs of concept. It's designed for mission-critical and operational excellence when you're using Node in production. The same sort of thing exists on the package manager side. So I talked about NPM earlier and how it caused widespread outages, and there was operational and revenue risk associated with that. We've solved that problem as well with this tool, Certified Modules, where we'll actually secure and also help you be more compliant with the packages that you're using. We've effectively reduced, if not completely eliminated, the risk associated with using untrusted third-party JavaScript. This is a tool that enables you to sleep well at night, that enables your teams to keep humming along without actually pulling in insecure packages, without pulling in packages that don't have a license. And just for reference, 30% of those packages in NPM today either don't have a license or don't have a permissive open source license, which means you're likely breaking some sort of compliance and you don't even know that it exists today. Next up, shadow IT. Sounds scary. It's not as scary as it sounds. Today, with open source technology and the way that developers are learning to build applications, whether it's in school or as a consultant or a contractor or freelancer or just figuring stuff out, they're all using open source technologies. They're going to find a way to bring that into your IT organization. So trying to stop that, I think, is a fleeting exercise. I think you have to have a strategy around how to expect it and manage around that. Next up is an adequate disclosure policy. What does this mean? Well, I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a website, which literally everybody does, and some white hat hacker, that's the good guy or gal, finds a vulnerability. How do they disclose that to you? How do they give you that information so that you can actually go fix it before somebody exposes it in a nefarious way? Excuse me. There's a new project. It's in alpha, so take it with a grain of salt, called SecurityTXT. And what this is, it's basically a security.txt file that you put in the root of your web server's directory, meaning anybody can go and look at this file and it will show an email address or some sort of contact information for how to disclose issues or vulnerabilities on any of your websites or web assets. Last but not least, and I see this trend happening in the banking sector specifically, is to reduce your proprietary tech footprint. It doesn't mean go away entirely. It means start to think about shifting away from specialized to something that's standardized, and that is things like open standards, such as web technology. So I'll give you another example. I know I kind of probably scared a few of you with Electron earlier, but this is something we're seeing at seemingly every bank, and I know our friends at OpenFin are very much focused on this as well. There's this shift away from the proprietary specialized Windows Presentation Foundation, or WPF, stack for building native Windows apps and moving towards things like Electron. Why would you do that? Because the standardized approach, using web technologies, gives your developers access to all the latest, greatest, and modern frameworks and toolkits and best practices, whereas with a very specialized .NET, C#, XAML stack, it's pretty limited, not only in terms of your talent pool, but in the types of benefits that you can get from that because it's such a specific siloed section. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for attending. Do we do questions? No. Yeah? Questions? 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 Just minds are blown. Yes, no questions? Literally no questions. Come on, somebody's gonna. Chuck, you have a question.
I have a question. So you mentioned how kind of we struggle with getting people to understand the difference between pulling something off the shelf. What are some of the, like the NodeSource project off the shelf, what are some of the techniques that you guys use to help demonstrate that value proposition to your market?
Yeah, so the question is how do you demonstrate the value for open source technology relative to, say, off-the-shelf offerings, right? A lot of this has to do with some of the bigger business drivers in the business itself. So I think the wrong approach is sort of fighting about the technical superiority of one technology versus another. You will always lose that debate, always, because nobody's ever right and everybody's right at the same time. So I don't think going the technological route is the right route. I think the right route is the business value drivers. So one of the examples I use is for things like why organizations adopt Node.js is, well, you can hire and retain talent because developers love to use Node. There's cost savings because Node.js has a unique asynchronous I/O model which allows you to reduce your infrastructure footprint. You can actually get time to market faster because you can have, say, a fully functioning web server in 5 lines of JavaScript as opposed to configuring Apache, configuring JBoss, spinning up all of your Java stuff. So the speed is a big benefit as well. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that focusing on what are the business value drivers relative to the technological or product aspect goes a lot further for helping people understand why it makes sense to adopt an open source technology versus something off the shelf. Any other questions? Yes.
From a business unit perspective, within volume main flex, where are you seeing the fastest adoption of open source?
Good question. So the question is in banking, what business unit specifically are we seeing the fastest adoption of open source technologies? All of them. There are certainly, every bank is different, and every bank is the smartest, right? So each bank will have, say, certain lines of business that have legacy applications that are just never going to get touched. But then you have other folks that are, I think, a little more technologically progressive because they have pressure on them from internal customers. So if you think about the front office, for example, beating up on your developers, say, I need this new graphing application for our Forex desk immediately, or whatever, right? At the end of the day, a developer has to do her job, and if she has access to open source technologies that enable her to do her job faster and more effectively, you'll start to see the footprint grow there. I think the other thing, though, is that, I mentioned this earlier, is certain lines of business have relied on their proprietary stacks for so long, and likely will. I'm sure many of the banks in here have their own secret sauce. But augmenting that, going forward with, say, how do I build a platform out of all this technology that we have internally and can expose that to our clients, whether they're retail or institutional or just developers. This is coming from seemingly everywhere across the board. Finally, I will say a couple banks that we talked to do have folks that are explicitly focused on the digital transformation aspect, and they are responsible for more or less determining the emerging technologies that they will end up using across multiple lines of business. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.